traditional values, worldviews, and land management practices. As an example, here are the Afro-Colombian communities that settled the western coast of Colombia, and that and whose cultural diversity and importance has been recently recognized. Well, has been recognized. Because of the way that local communities and indigenous peoples relate with their land, they have several positive impacts on biodiversity conservation and ecosystem services. Probably the main one is the prevention of the loss of habitat through land stewardship. Also, they are the guardians of the genetic diversity of domesticated crops and animal breeds. And through their land management practice, they create unique and diverse ecosystems, like, for example, through the management of fire. And finally, themselves, they have an intrinsic value as part of the what has been called the ethnosphere and their cultural diversity of the world. Just an example of the importance of these lands for conservation, it's that it has been shown repeatedly that indigenous territories and local communities land management practices prevent deforestation and habitat loss in many cases. Here is just an example from Brazil, where to the left we have the deforestation rates just outside the indigenous territories borders, and to the right, the deforestation rates inside the community, the indigenous territory border. This is a graphic showing that has already accounted for confounding factors such as accessibility to the area and other factors, showing that definitely there is an impact of having an indigenous territory on deforestation rates. And because of this, also these indigenous territories are very important in the provision of ecosystem services. Here is one of the most studied ecosystem services, above ground carbon capture, showing that for the Amazon forest, at least 27% of the stored carbon it's under indigenous management or under indigenous territories. And for this goes also for biodiversity. Here there is a study showing for several areas the amount of vertebrate species richness covered or protected, comparing indigenous territories, protected areas, and non-protected areas, which showed that indigenous territories, indigenous land had the same or even more diversity in several cases than protected areas. So these studies and the examples I have shown point to the fact that indigenous territories and local communities are key for biodiversity conservation and its ecosystem services. But finer scale studies are needed, both at a spatial and at taxa level, to better understand the impact of indigenous territories on biodiversity conservation, and use this understanding to promote both cultural and diversity conservation, and look for synergies among these two worldwide priorities. With this in mind, here I will show you the work on assessing the relationship between jaguar conservation and indigenous territories and local communities in Colombia. We are interested in the jaguar because it's a top predator, and although the species is categorized as near threatened, it has lost 50% of its range in the past 100 years, and with continued losing of both distribution area and individuals and population size. This is also a landscape species which conservation might help the conservation of biodiversity in general, as well as several ecological processes. And finally, the jaguar is a very important species. Culturally speaking, it is important in the myths and the cosmogony of different indigenous peoples through all the neotropics. I will be working with the framework of the Jaguar Corridor Initiative, which it's based on the finding that jaguars don't present sharp genetic divisions or what could be called subspecies, but it's rather a continuous genetic gradient, leading to the idea of conserving the species through its range and its connectivity. This corridor initiative is based on the identification of what has been called Jaguar Conservation Units, or JCUs, as I will be calling them through the talk, which are areas that can or are predicted to have viable populations in the long term. Well, to currently have viable populations, or to have the habitat and prey availability with the potential to eventually harbor a viable population. And then the idea is to connect these jaguar conservation units through corridors to maintain the genetic diversity through the jaguar range. With this in mind, the objectives of my study were to first assess the overlap between the Jaguar Corridor Initiative, both jaguar conservation units and corridors, and the indigenous territories and local communities in Colombia. Also estimate the deforestation of jaguar range in protected areas, as well as in community territories and other land tenure types in Colombia. And finally, look it from the other way, evaluate what is the cultural diversity contained within the jaguar conservation units in Colombia. Here, I include two types of local communities for Colombia. First, the indigenous territories, and then also the Afro-Colombian communities that, which since 1993 have been given the right to have communal lands through the western part of the country. So I used three input data sets. First, the Afro-Colombian territories granted and recognized by the government in Colombia. Of course, this is from a government source. So, and the title ones. So these might not include territories that are de facto occupied and used by Afro-Colombian communities, but currently doesn't have a title right. So that's something to take into account. Then the indigenous territories in the country. This data set includes both the recognized one as well as the ones where the known occurrence or known occupancy from indigenous peoples have been shown. And finally, the shapefile of protected areas in the country. So intersected the corridors and the jaguar conservation units with protected areas. to identify the percentage that it's protected, the percentage that it's covered by indigenous territories, the percentage that it's covered by Colombian territories, Afro-Colombian territories, as well as the percentage that overlaps both indigenous territories and protected areas, and the percentage that includes Afro-Colombian communities and protected areas. Also, I evaluated the percentage that was under other land tenures, such as private lands and state non-protected lands. Then for each of these categories, I estimated the percentage of cover loss from 2000 to 2020. I used the Hansen dataset for forest cover at 2000 and updated it to 2020 using the loss and gain dataset from the same author using Google Earth engine. And finally, to assess the overlap of cultural diversity with the Jaguar range, I used as a proxy the endangered languages occurring in Jaguar conservation areas. Here, I'm not sure of how well the endangered languages dataset represents cultural diversity, but I am assuming it's a proxy, and I would love to hear the comments if there are social scientists or anthropologists in these audiences. I georeference the language, the location or the occurrence of languages from the Endangered Languages Project dataset, which classifies the languages into 6 categories from critically endangered to vulnerable. So here are the results. In the right, you can have for reference the Jaguar distribution or the Jaguar conservation units in green and the corridors in gray. Here you have the overlap between protected areas, hatched in the hatched areas, indigenous territories as brown, Afro-Colombian communities as golden, the corridors as blue, and the Jaguar conservation units in green, sorry. So here we see a huge overlap between Afro-Colombian territories in the Chocó Jaguar conservation unit and with indigenous territories both in the Amazonian and Orinoco conservation units, Jaguar conservation unit, as well as on the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta conservation unit. Here it's a display of this. You can see in the map 2 variables, the percentage covered by indigenous territories and local communities that goes from white to yellow, and the percentage covered by protected areas. We can see that the Amazon it has a high percentage of both cover of protected areas and indigenous territories, while, for example, the Chocó conservation units has a high percentage of local communities covered, but not much protected areas. The Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, the Paramillo area, and the Catatumbo area are somehow intermediate, while the Serranía de San Lucas and Magdalena Medio Jaguar Conservation Unit has both low coverage of indigenous territories and local communities, as well as low coverage of protected areas. Quantitatively, we can see that from the around 700,000 square kilometers of Jaguar conservation units in Colombia, 25% of them are protected. but more than 60% is covered by indigenous territories and local communities, showing the importance of these territories in the Jaguar, in the global and national Jaguar conservation and strategy. Regarding deforestation, we found that there was a 4.6% loss of forest cover from the Jaguar conservation units, which remain to this day remain 76% forested. It's very interesting that to see that this loss comes mostly from other land use types, which had a huge forest loss percentage of 13%. Here you can see the current forest 2020 in green, and the forest lost from 2000 up to date in red. Very interestingly, also, indigenous territories showed a lower rate of deforestation, or a lower forest loss percentage than even the protected areas. And the Afro-Colombian community territories showed a comparable forest loss of 2 protected areas. This 4.6% increase, deforestation rate, it's alarming, given that the last assessment showed that deforestation of Jaguar conservation units between 2000 and 2012 were only 1.5%. And this might be related to the peace agreement that occurred at 2014, that several authors have shown with improved security, deforestation also increased in several areas. Here you can see the deforestation rates at places without the park, which was the main guerrilla acting in Colombia, and for places with park, before and after the peace agreement, which is signaled here with the blue line. So the deforestation increased, and this might be why we are seeing such an increase in the Jaguar, in deforestation rates of Jaguar habitat. But again, this data shows that indigenous territories have lower deforestation rates. And here there are just a couple of examples of how we see that deforestation within indigenous territories it's lower than outside them. Here it's clear that the indigenous territory act as a barrier to the deforestation occurred during the last 20 years. Regarding corridors, we have that the corridors occupy almost 38,000 square kilometers, of which 17% are in indigenous territories and local communities' land, and 9% it's occupied, or it's covered by protected areas. So here we see the opposite. Here for corridors, the other land uses, land tenure types are more prevalent and more important in their conservation. Regarding deforestation through corridors, we see a similar trend, but here we start with a lower lower percentage of forested area in the corridors, which makes sense, and that's precisely probably why they are classified as corridors and not as Jaguar conservation units. But we see a similar pattern: higher deforestation rates in other land tenure types than in protected areas, in the indigenous territories, and Afro-Colombian communities. Finally, regarding cultural diversity, we have here the distribution of endangered languages through the territory of Colombia, overlapping with both corridors and Jaguar conservation units, showing a high coincidence. We can see here that the 73% of the 67 endangered languages that occur in Colombia occur within Jaguar conservation units or Jaguar corridors, and even the critically endangered languages occur, all of them within Jaguar conservation units. So as a conclusion, we have that there is a huge potential and necessity of including indigenous territories and local communities in national and international Jaguar conservation strategies. Most of the prioritized land for Jaguar conservation lies within their territories. So they are key players for Jaguar conservation, at least at the level of Colombia. We also have indications through this data that these local community territories have contributed to Jaguar conservation through the avoidance of deforestation. This study needs to be extended to account for confounding factors such as accessibility and other factors, but this data indicates that there is a real contribution of these territories to Jaguar conservation through avoided deforestation. And also we found that Jaguar range sampled most of the country's cultural diversity using, of course, endangered languages as a proxy. So this shows and points that there is a great potential for synergies between biodiversity and cultural conservation using the Jaguar as a landscape and umbrella species. The future directions will be first to formally evaluate the role of communal land titles on deforestation in Jaguar range, as I mentioned earlier, accounting for other factors. Also, there is the need, and it will be very interesting to assess other threats, what happened with other threats besides deforestation at indigenous territories and local communities. For example, jaguar hunting, prey hunting, conflict with livestock will be necessary to evaluate if we're going to include and do more about the jaguar in these territories. Also, it will be very interesting and important to evaluate the cultural importance of the jaguar, both in indigenous territories where we already know they are, this is a very important species culturally, but also in local communities of the Afro-Colombian local communities, which have a long history of being in the area, and we don't know yet how their cosmovision and how their culture relates with jaguar, except for a couple of localized studies. And finally, the question here, which will be very interesting, and well, we will need a lot of work to tackle, will be to assess if the jaguar can be used in the preservation of traditional knowledge culture, if we can find synergies for the preservation of cultural diversity, as well as the conservation of the jaguar and biological diversity. With this, I would like to ask for comments and questions. In the acknowledgements, this work has been done. I have done with this work with Dr. Joe Figel, many of whom ideas are present here. Also, I would like to acknowledge all the groups doing the work of digitizing and making data on indigenous territories and local communities available. My wife, Mar, who helped me with the presentation, and all of you for being here. Thank you very much.